Hi, Stephen here from Fated Crossings. Welcome to the YouTube channel of the Fated Crossings Astrological Consultancy. I've been doing some posts about the partial lunar eclipse in Scorpio, as well as the Mars-Uranus opposition, and we've had some very tragic validations of these astrological events, most notably the Christmas Parade tragedy in Waukesha, Wisconsin. When I was talking about these events, the eclipse, the Mars-Uranus opposition, I said that outbursts of sudden violence are completely common with these, and for that reason, they're not really worth getting into. Like, we knew something gnarly was about to happen, but it's kind of depressing and we don't want to dwell on it, so to speak. But nevertheless, the event was entirely predictable, as you'll see in the charts that we're about to examine. Analysis of these charts is very educational, very, very educational, because we can see the event in all of its fullness, in all of its lethality, right there in the pertinent charts. Now, how predictable was this? Well, on the one hand, it was quite predictable, because we know outbursts of sudden mayhem are going to occur with Mars opposed to Uranus. And with eclipses, we're used to that. However, I seriously doubt that astrologers across the globe woke up one morning and after their tea and biscuits said, let's see what's happening in the fascinating microcosm that is Waukesha, Wisconsin, right? So determining the locale of the tragedy would have posed a challenge. Wouldn't have been impossible, but would have posed a challenge. Nevertheless, we can examine these charts ex post facto after the event and learn a lot about how astrology works by looking at them. Take a look. This is the lunar eclipse chart of November the 19th, cast for Waukesha, Wisconsin, the location of the Christmas Parade tragedy. And the first thing we might notice is that the eclipse is in the 8th house, the house of death. It involves an exalted moon. So what this means is that the moon, the eclipse, is not only in the house of death, it is a very important ruler of it. And this is our first clue that something gnarly is going to go down in Waukesha. We might also notice that, of course, Uranus is in the sign, very close to the cusp of the 8th house. But also, we would notice that the eclipse is in the term of Mars, which makes a Mars influence very prominent with the eclipse effects. The terms are very important. They are also rulers of things, the terms of the signs. So we look at the 8th house cusp and notice that it is in the term of Jupiter, and Jupiter is in the 5th house. The 5th house will be an important recurring theme throughout this technical analysis. Why? Because the 5th house rules over parades. 5th house is children, but also recreations and entertainments, banquets, restaurants, pubs, celebrations, parties, and parades. So Jupiter is one of the rulers of the 8th house in the house of parades. Now, we would also obviously want to look at the rising sign and its rulers. Venus and Saturn both tie. Venus rules the sign of the rising, and for that reason, she would get 5 points. Saturn is the exalted ruler of Libra, and he gets 4 points. But look, the ascendant degree is in the decan of Saturn. That's an additional 1 point. So Saturn has 5 points, and Venus also has 5 points. So this means that both of these planets equally influence the people of Waukesha. They equally describe the people of Waukesha with respect to this eclipse. And Venus is in the 4th whole sign, very close to the cusp. Saturn is in the 5th whole sign of parades, but also in the fourth Placidus house, angular. And Saturn is retreating from the fifth house cusp. So that's actually kind of an accurate symbol of the people retreating from the parade. Not to mention the fact that Saturn is just by definition a rather lugubrious and solemn, grave vibration. And Venus, the other ruler of the people of Waukesha, is in the domicile of Saturn. So she is thoroughly Saturnian. Now, one recurring theme of my astrology is that the fourth house has secondary meanings of morbidity. Not primary meanings, but secondary, maybe even tertiary. Primarily, the fourth house is your ancestors. Then it's your real estate, your home life, and then finally it's the ending of things. It's got this sort of gruesome or macabre subtext to it. So the fact that both rulers of the Ascendant are in the fourth in different ways speaks to the seriousness of this eclipse. Additionally, Venus is not only the ruler of the rising sign, she's the ruler of the eighth house cusp. So she's the Lord of life and of death. And so with this knowledge, we can examine her sextile to Mars in a new light, because Venus is applying to sextile Mars. It's a forming sextile at the time of the eclipse, because Venus is at 12 degrees of Capricorn and Mars is at 13 degrees of Scorpio. So Venus is moving towards perfecting the sextile. And because she is in her triplicity, she is pushing some of her power onto Mars. But at the same time, she is in the exaltation of Mars, and Mars himself is in his own domicile. What it all boils down to is that this is a more than typically powerful sextile. Venus is transferring some of her responsibility for life to Mars. And this is important because Mars is the driver of the car, the crazed motorist who plowed into the spectators of the parade. Why? Because Mars rules the seventh. Mars is that individual. More specifically, the entire stellium in Scorpio represents that individual. But for our purposes here, analyzing the sextile between Venus and Mars, we can see that by applying to Mars, Venus is transferring some of her power, some of her management responsibilities to Mars. So it all boils down to this crazed motorist having a lot of responsibility in his hands, even though he didn't deserve it and he did something terrible with it. He still had that transference of responsibility and management from Venus, the lady of life and death, ruler of the first and eighth. He still had that transference of responsibility from Venus in this forming sextile. Venus is pushing onto Mars this responsibility. So here we have the general setup. But looking deeper, we can analyze the Arabic part of death. How do we calculate that? First, we take the distance between the moon and the eighth house cusp. And so we see, going in the order of signs, it goes all the way around the circle, right, to here. So it might actually be simpler to calculate the part by going backwards, because this is a shorter arc, a shorter interval. So we take this batch of degrees and we calculate it from Saturn. Now this is interesting because usually 98% of the time with Arabic parts, we are going to calculate them using the Ascendant. But the part of death we use Saturn. We calculate it from Saturn. So we take this little arc of degrees, moving backwards from moon to the eighth house cusp, because that's just easier and more sensible. And since we moved backwards, we got to move backwards from Saturn, the fixed term in the equation. And so the Arabic part of death falls at about 26 degrees of Capricorn in the term of Mars. Just like the eclipse was in the term of Mars, the Arabic part of death is also in the term of Mars and in his exaltation. So for his exaltation, he gets 4 points. For the term, he gets an additional 2 points. So he gets 6 points of influence over the part of death. Whereas Saturn, The domicile ruler only gets 5. Therefore, Mars is lord of the part of death. This is very important because not only is Mars our antagonist in this saga, he is also ruler of the part of death. Now, the part of death is at 26 Capricorn is conjunct Pluto, but Venus, the lady of life and death, because she rules the 8th house cusp and the 1st house cusp, the ascendant degree, Venus is also with the part of death or on the part of death. So this is a blatant association of the people of Waukesha with death. Now, why is there a part of death and also an 8th house ruling over death? What's the difference between the two? Well, the part of death shows the death experience. The 8th house shows the causes of death. But the part of death shows what the experience of death is like. And we also would note that the eclipse is trining both Pluto and the part of death. So it all boils down to an air or an aura of lethality surrounding this eclipse for the location of Waukesha, Wisconsin. Finally, we might notice that the ascendant degree, this ascendant degree at 12 degrees and 27 minutes of Libra, casts its 12th part into Aquarius. Now, I will have a lot to say about 12th parts. They go by different names, but the simplest, easiest name to call them is 12th parts. They are essentially divisions of any sign into 12 equal parts of 2.5 degrees apiece. And so using that scheme, the 12th part of the rising degree goes into Aquarius. So this gives us an important subtone. What is the eclipse all about? What is this entire chart all about? Well, 5th house things, parades. So now let us look at the event chart of the parade attack itself, which is actually not as informative as the actual eclipse chart. The eclipse chart supersedes or dominates this event chart. Nevertheless, there are a few features that I want to point out. First of all, the opposition between Mars and Uranus is still strong, is still ongoing. I mentioned in an earlier post about this opposition that sudden attacks of violence are quite common with this particular combination of these two bodies. A few other interesting features of this chart. The 8th house cusp is in the, actually it's in the term of Mars and the sign of Jupiter, right? The whole sign 8th house is ruled by Saturn, but the Placidus houses are actually more informative here. The cusp of the 8th house is in the term of Jupiter, term of Mars, saying something violent about death, about the 8th house. But Jupiter rules the 8th house cusp, and he is angular in the 10th house, angular, very powerful. And Jupiter is in a sextile with Mercury, who rules the ascendant. So the Lord of Death, is in a square with Mercury. The Lord of Death is squaring the Lord of Life, which is pretty apt symbolism, if you ask me. Venus, who ruled the ascendant of the eclipse chart, is in the house of death in the event chart. Now, one other interesting feature is that the part of death in the eclipse chart at 26 degrees of Capricorn casts its contra-antiscia to right around the 3rd degree of Gemini. This ascendant is just a few degrees away. In other words, the ascendant of the event chart is conjunct the contra-antiscia of the part of death. And if that sounds like some astrological gobbledygook, then that's probably because it is. It is like a bunch of technical jargon. And if you are not familiar with antiscia and contra-antiscia, then you will not know what the hell I'm talking about. Antiscia is the plural of antiscion. This is actually a fascinating concept. And in order to understand it, we have to examine the Cancer-Gemini axis and the Capricorn-Sagittarius axis. Okay? So, summertime happens at 0 degrees of Cancer. So the antiscion is this. When the sun is at 1 degree of Cancer, there is the same amount of sunlight in that day as when the sun is at 29 of Gemini. And when the sun is at 2 degrees of Cancer, there's the same amount of daylight in that day as when the sun is at 28 degrees of Gemini. And when the sun is at 3 degrees of Cancer, there is the same precise amount of daylight in that day as when the sun is at 27 degrees of Gemini. And this system fans outward. Okay? So what it means is that when the sun is at 26 degrees of Capricorn, the location of the part of death in the eclipse chart, then that day has the same amount of daylight as when the sun is at 4 degrees of Sagittarius. Now, that's the antiscion. The antiscion of the part of death of the eclipse chart is at 4 degrees of Sagittarius. And so that would be like a conjunction. But the contra-antiscion would be at 4 degrees of Gemini. So in other words, on the day of the event itself, the Christmas parade is happening. Everybody's feeling all Christmassy, right? If we go back to the eclipse chart set for Waukesha, then we have Jupiter, Lord of the term of the House of Death, in the 5th Christmas parade. You know, everybody is feeling all Christmassy and Jupiterian and having a great time. But then when the chart of the day clicks around to 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees of Gemini, hitting the antiscion, the contra-antiscion of the part of death of the eclipse chart, boom, the event occurs. And by the way, the ascendant degree of this particular event chart has its 12th part in the 3rd, very close to the Imam Cheli, the 4th house cusp. And the part of death for this event chart is also in the 3rd. Why is the 3rd important? It too has pertinence for parades, because the festivity of the parade is a 5th house thing. Nevertheless, the actual roadway used in the parade, the conveyances used in the parades, the communal nature of the parade, the community spirit of the parade is definitely a 3rd house matter. And finally, I just want to point out that Saturn, who naturally signifies death, just because of his generic definitions given the history of astrology. Over thousands and thousands of years, Saturn has accumulated significations of morbidity, and he is opposing the part of death. He is opposing it by degree. Uranus and Mars are squaring the part of death. So all of this adds up to a lethal Christmas Day parade, at least in Waukesha, Wisconsin. So there you have it, a technical analysis of the Waukesha tragedy as shown by the eclipse chart and the actual event chart. Now, another interesting thing to note is that a lot of these very interesting or prominent points, such as the 8th house cusp, the placement of Venus ruling the ascendant of the eclipse, the placement of the part of death in the eclipse chart, involve earth signs. And when we think of earth signs, we think of collisions, right? Thinking of it in the most literal terms possible. Collisions, sudden impacts. So the scope of the tragedy and its magnitude becomes easily perceptible ex post facto through these charts. And astrology is great for that. We certainly can learn a lot from tragedies after they occur by looking at charts. Astrology offers us a way to rationalize the chaos of the event. We might not can reverse the tragedy, but at least we have augmented tools for understanding it. we have a way for understanding the chaos, and that's comforting. So until next time, I hope you have a marvelous week, and if you want to contact me, the address is Stephen@fadedcrossings.com. See you.